ideally, in our opinion, a good moat for a company is one where you can kind of imagine the classic question of someone comes in with unlimited money, unlimited talent, and still, despite all of those things, they would have a very difficult time replicating exactly what's happening or the magic behind the company that we're building. You've got AI, you've got the best tools in the world, but whatever AI insights or algorithms are going to build are only going to be as good as the data that we're building on top of.
Because you hear a lot about them at the moment with AI, collapsing moats, that speed is the moat or capital is the moat. They're not moats in the long run. They are a head start that gives you the right to start digging an actual moat over time.
In the world of like medical devices where there's a hardware element, the moat is actually the end-to-end experience. From the moment you open the package, the features that are contained on the hardware element, all the way to how the user uses the app, which traditionally by medical device companies, that's not their forte. So it's really that end-to-end experience. And I think that's very misunderstood by most people.
I think the best moats typically are very non-consensus. And I think my reminder for founders would be sometimes you feel like you're the only one that understands why you've got a great moat. And that is actually a great place to be in.
Consumer has become quite a dirty word in European VC. The story goes, AI killed consumer software, hardware is too capital intensive. Anything you build, someone else can build cheaper, faster, or with a better model behind it. I don't buy that story, and neither do today's guests. Sava is building one of the most defensible consumer companies in Europe, in hardware no less, and they have a sharper way of thinking about moats than almost anyone I have met. Joining me as co-host on the investor side is Joe from True, who've spent 2 decades looking at consumer companies that they thought had moats and those that didn't. We're going to take apart what makes up a strong, powerful moat in consumer in this episode. Let's get into it. Welcome, guys.
Hey,
thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
This show is not investment advice, and the hosts of this episode may be invested in the funds and companies featured.
So, Ren and Raf, I would just ask both of you to really quickly explain to everyone who are you and what are you building with Sava, just in case someone doesn't know.
Awesome. Yeah. My name is Ren. Raf is the other counterpart on the call. We are Sava, and in a nutshell, we're building a new technical foundation for personalized and preventative health. We basically built this new wearable platform that enables us to do basically measurements of the molecules that are flowing underneath your skin in real time. It's becoming increasingly clear that generating personalized health insights in all health applications is going to be dependent on continuous molecular data. And that's exactly what we're unlocking with our new platform. It's a brand new technology that we bring from the ground up. And that's what we're bringing to market to be able to streamline the molecules that are flowing beneath your skin in real time, directly connected to your phone.
Raf, say a few words so people know your voice, because those that are walking with their headphones are going to be like, who's this third voice now?
Yeah, I think Ren said it already, but maybe to add something very particular, we've built our own technology from scratch. Here in London, we manufacture everything in-house, and we've built these very, very small sensors that only penetrate the first layer of your skin, so they're completely painless. They still enable us to accurately, in a clinically relevant fashion, monitor molecules flowing under your skin. And this constitutes the foundation for generating low-level signals, which then we can use to provide personalized insight and other relevant metrics to our users.
And obviously, to everyone who's listening in here, this episode is focused on Sava as the case study for how you can build moats in consumer. And we're doing that together with Joe from True, because we're building a series with him to figure out, and the team at True, what really constitutes a powerful consumer company in today's tech world. Joe, maybe you would talk a bit to both how you think about moats as like the way that to take us into this conversation, but also maybe put the wider context of this little journey we're on together.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, as you mentioned at the start of the call, I think consumer has become a dirty word, and we obviously, as a consumer sector specialist fund, fundamentally disagree with that. I think one of the key things that we love about consumer is that the winners can be enormous winners, and that typically is because they benefit from moats that compound and evolve over time, as we'll get into. We first met the Sava guys probably 18 months ago now, we'd spent a lot of time looking at the preventative wellness space and came to the same conclusion every time, which was the hardware is a real limiting factor here. And so we felt that the kind of vertically integrated approach that the guys are taking was a fundamental unlock, a fundamental step change in what the end consumer experience, you could deliver really was. And then alongside that, built an incredible set of moats to start building a generational healthcare company out of Europe. So we're excited about consumer in general, these guys in particular, and looking forward to unpacking some of the reasons that we feel these guys are on to building something massive across the course of this episode.
So guys, I used to study strategy and organization, which means that I grew up with Porter's 5 forces. And I think that in venture, it surprises me every time I meet an engineer or operator turned VC that doesn't know Porter's 5 forces. But it really does exist, and it baffles me every time. I would say that while this conversation is super important, if people haven't read Porter's 5 forces and not just seen the model, but actually read his piece, I think there is a lot that you can deduce from there. That is my small promo for Mr. Porter, our good OG strategy. Now let's get into what moats actually are in tech. I don't want to start though with the moats. I think we should start with what a moat is there for, because obviously a moat is there to defend against something. And those are threats. I think that we should start the conversation with what are the threats that you at Sava are building to protect from?
It boils down to what you define as what is a moat. And I guess probably we've got our own definition of what we think that is. And ultimately, the way that we're thinking about it is that something that is defensible, obviously, but I guess something that makes it really challenging for someone else to be able to really easily come in and replicate exactly what we're doing. Ideally, in our opinion, a good moat for a company is one where you can kind of imagine the classic question of someone comes in with unlimited money, unlimited talent, and still, despite all of those things, they would have a very difficult time replicating exactly what's happening or the magic behind the company that we're building. And there's multiple different ways which we think we're tackling this. A lot of it is always thinking a little bit differently to where the traditional consumer space we think has been thinking historically. But I guess ultimately that's kind of what it boils down to, in our opinion. It's something that enables you to build a company which someone with unlimited money and unlimited talent wouldn't very easily be able to step in and replicate everything that you're doing overnight. And it definitely does take a lot of effort. But yeah, I guess that's kind of like probably how we're thinking about it.
What are the threats you're guarding against? What are the threats that you as Sava are looking at and keeping you up at night?
I mean, there's a never-ending list. Where do we even start? I guess practically due to the nature of what we're building is just the sheer complexity of what we have. Obviously, we're taking the approach where we're focusing on a core infrastructure bottleneck that we see in the continuous monitoring space. And being able to do that is extremely capital intensive. It requires a lot of effort. It's a much longer horizon to get a product to market. So most of our time, I guess, historically, even up until now, the company has been focusing on that, is how do we build something that no one's been able to achieve, working on a technological breakthrough that enables us to basically unlock this unlimited series of opportunities in health monitoring. And that's just like a very different way in which I think traditionally the consumer space has been looking at. But some of the threats, I guess, ultimately from our perspective, are more than threats, I would call them difficulties of building what we're doing, has always been kind of this long-term horizon or long-term bets to kind of believe in the fact that if we do solve some of these existential core infrastructural problems that we're seeing in continuous monitoring our health, then that will be worth it. And that will lead in a massive opportunity that we else wouldn't be able to pursue. So most of it is about, how do we get a technology that works really well? How do we build a team that has the technical ability to be able to execute towards that? How do we make sure that we're appropriately funded? How do we navigate the regulatory framework of the company or of the first product that we're building? So all these things, I think, ultimately are kind of the things that we've been really focusing historically on the company, which is probably, pretty unconventional for a consumer company to be thinking about. But I guess really what we've been leaning in the last couple of years. So I'll say, I don't know if that directly answered your question, but probably look at it in terms of what we've actually been focusing on the last couple of years.
One of the things that I'm thinking a lot about when I saw Sava, and we also spoke about when we first met, was this looming risk that there'll be a non-invasive sensing disruption from something like Apple Watches, which it feels like every other month a new article drops about. Now it's going to come. You laughed the last time we spoke about it, Ren, and Sava. You're laughing now, so maybe we should turn to you. Why are you laughing? Why are you saying that that's not one of the risks that we are guarding against?
I mean, you can always consider it a risk. It's depending where in the stack of risk you have it. I would say it's been a risk maybe for the past 20 years. And every year there's been many articles saying, this year's the year, this year's the year. So internally we say the promise of non-invasive sensing is 5 years away and will always be, basically. Fundamentally, no one has been able to prove to us that it was even theoretically feasible without some magical breakthrough. Maybe at some point there would be this magical breakthrough, but even doing it outside of the body, non-invasively sensing molecules is not currently being done. So if you add the complexity of the human body on top of this, then it's kind of like way too many variables. So if you think about like traditional lab testing where you take a bodily fluid out of you like blood, and then you separate the blood from the plasma, and then you put it in like these big machines. If they could do this non-invasively, well, it would massively increase throughput and reduce cost. But at the moment, they don't do it. So then it's kind of like, now we're saying that not only we can do it non-invasively, but we can actually shine a light through the skin, which absorbs most wavelength. And then on top of this, all these molecules that you can control changing minute by minute at different rates, and you could detect just this single molecule. We don't think that's feasible.
With you guys, I mean, we talked a lot when we were first getting to know you. There are obviously medical device companies that are building the hardware component or an element of the hardware component for preventive health monitoring for diabetes, etc. You guys were always very firm on the value of a sort of vertically integrated consumer-led proposition. So how did you think about your right to win versus, these giants that have decades of experience and expansive distribution networks globally?
I mean, there are probably two components. There's the pure hardware element, and this was, do we think we can actually build a better hardware experience? And then there was the entire, I would say, end-to-end experience. And when we initially looked at the end-to-end experience, I mean, these big medical device companies have been built most of them almost pre-internet. I guess Ren and I don't know pre-internet. So we grew up in a world where like smartphones and connected devices were already there. For them, it was way more centered around meeting a patient need as opposed to meeting a consumer need, which I think is very different. But since that world is merging, the patient world and the consumer world, they're essentially merging. Right now, they're trying to play catch up and say, okay, we want that consumer experience, but inherently the company hasn't been built for this because, I don't know, a traditional medical device company, maybe they build like a stent to open an artery. And in this case, well, it's all about the patient experience. You don't have anything consumer facing. So that's where their bread and butter is, and that's where they came from. For us, it was naturally to be like, well, why? We can use all these apps. You can use the Uber app. You can use all these apps that you're used to. The experience is pretty seamless. Well, when you use something that should save your life, the experience is terrible. Like there's a disconnect here. So we're like, we feel like we can solve this problem. And obviously, you have this naivety of building a company, and you're like, well, of course we can solve all of these problems, and also we can also solve these problems all at once. So I think that's how it came about more than anything else.
Joe, I would love to ask you so now we've spoken a bit about threats, and I think that we could continue our conversation to GLP-1s, them being a potential risk. I know that you personally don't think they are. They're probably even a good thing for you because it makes people more focused around their health and so on. A bit afraid of putting words in your mouth here, but it's not the core of the conversation, so I'm okay with it. But now, Joe, I would love to ask you, because I know that from your many observations from investing in consumer companies, one of the things you've noticed is that building moats, part of doing that in a smart way is actually about resource allocation, because you can't build all moats at the same time. It's massively resource intensive. And at the same time, it's also not all of it equally important at all points. Can you talk a bit about what you've observed when you think one type of moat is more important than the other, and how founders can think about that? Obviously, it's different from company to company, but I imagine that there are some abstractions that are worth making.
Yeah, for sure. I think if you think about the kind of classic moats that everybody talks about, things like economies of scale, things like distribution moats, even network effects to a certain extent. Obviously, by definition, as a startup, you don't have those things and you don't really have access to those things, right? So what we really like is when founders are very clear-eyed around the sequencing of how they're going to build, firstly, an initial proposition that you want to defend, because the thing that we've talked about is, the moat, but we haven't talked about what's inside the moat. So the first thing is obviously coming up with a value proposition that cuts through in a really compelling way. And then how you're thinking about sequencing the moats over time to build defensibility in the short run, but ideally get to a point where you have this kind of compounding advantage over time. So for example, when we talk about something like a regulatory approval or a regulatory framework, or even a specific piece of technology innovation, that's a really helpful starting point to give you that initial right to then start building a moat. But they're threshold factors. Once you're over those points, to Ren's earlier point, another team coming along with plenty of capital and plenty of resources could probably achieve those same thresholds. What we really like, and where we've seen historically in consumer businesses, the sort of winner takes all dynamics play out, is where as the business scales, you're building moats that compound, and they're much more of a dynamic system. So I think an example might be, if you think about something like Spotify, for example, their initial moat was they were the people who had licensed the rights to deliver music streaming to end consumers. But then over time, as they built and scaled, they built all of the personalization, all of the data features, all of the social features, the creative features. And now, in 2026, the original product that got them the initial escape velocity is a commodity. You can stream music through lots of different platforms, but they've managed to evolve the business and grow different moats over time as they've been able to scale internationally. So I think having that clear-eyed view of what we're going to do when in a world of limited resources is a really important perspective that we love founders to have from day one.
Ren, I took notes when you spoke before, because what you said when we asked you about moats was really that the moats that you are describing as the ones that you have, and keeping in mind that you're a consumer hardware company. IP, absolutely important. Regulatory navigation across the different European markets and the US, incredibly important, incredibly necessary for you to even be able to get in the business. And then a deep technical know-how and talent density that you keep building up. And this is, of course, the early stage, because then comes the next stage, which we could call the mid stage, which is then platform and compounding, which for you is the multi-analyte. Maybe you can talk a bit about how you're thinking about right now, and how you're then thinking about the next stage, which we might call late stage, and where you're building out that ecosystem lock-in and distribution platform that's different from everyone else. And you can even start bundling if you get to that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the way that we look at it, I guess to kind of repeating some of the obvious things, is that the traditional medical device space, or kind of like building in the hardware space, you've got the high technical barrier. So just like building something really difficult, and you need tremendous amount of just resources and capabilities to be able to build that. The second one is patents, right? And patents in the medical device space are completely overused, in the sense of everyone's always defending or hiding behind a massive patent portfolio. And the third one is regulatory clearance, which obviously we need for some of the molecules that we want to be sensing with at the beginning. But over time, I think where we see a lot of companies, especially in the medical device space, becoming pretty lazy in the way that they think about iteration and innovation of the product, is that they defend or they hide behind their patents for a very long period of time. And routinely what happens is that when those patents start expiring, then all of a sudden you open up for copycats, incumbents, which have a lot of money and catch up extremely fast. So the way that we're designing intentionally from day one, the technology behind Sava, is making sure that we could actually keep on building over time around that. So multi-analyte is one of them. So for existing systems right now to go outside of glucose monitoring, which is kind of like the biggest molecular tracking platform today, it is extremely challenging. Whereas we built our sensing platform in a way that we can really easily start expanding outside of that. So actually, it is very, very difficult for us to get the first application out, so from glucose, but the additional molecules after that would be extremely or much, much simpler to be able to prove out. We've got a platform which is minimally invasive that we know is stable into the body that we can build upon that. So starting to expand and iterate and have more molecules after that becomes really easy. And at that point, you become pretty much the only platform that can do multiple different molecules at the same time. Each molecule unlocks a new set of insights that you can derive, right? So with glucose, you can get diabetes, you can get metabolic health, you can get weight loss, some performance. But as you start adding other molecules, you start unlocking other applications in health as well. And you'll get to a point where ultimately people will gravitate towards the platform that enables them to get the most insights, where you can get every health application, no matter what your health goal is. And at that point, it kind of becomes, okay, you've got this one sensing platform that gives you everything about your health that you need. And at that point, it becomes really difficult for people to start replicating the same thing that we have. So, I mean, just to echo what Joe was saying, there's definitely a sequencing element. So you kind of want to get the first systems up and running, which are typically, patents, regulatory frameworks. But then after that is the expansion outside of this. And I think the way that we see it is going to be about multiple different molecules, multiple different insights in health and applications in health, and continuous monitoring set at the epicenter of that. So that's kind of really where we see the long-term moat being at Sava. And then to your point, like you can see this all over again. It's even massive companies and Microsoft, it's not like they have the one specific, the video conferencing tool. So Teams is not really the best video conferencing tool, but it's just part of a bundle that gives you everything. So if you use a computer, you just want to have all of it in one place. And that's what's really powerful about it. And I think in health monitoring, the same kind of thing will happen. It's, you kind of start gravitating towards the one platform that does it all. You're not going to go around with 20 different wearables that gives you 20 different things. And if you have one system that can give you everything, I think that's ultimately where people will start converging towards.
I would love to ask you a question, which is almost not okay. Because I want to ask you to comment on the two incumbents, Abbott's Freestyle Libre and Dexcom. Just because I think it's interesting to hear, how does a startup verbalize you're thinking about the incumbents as competition and how you're shielding against that and them and how you're trying to stay ahead of them and moving in a way where you're not sometimes not getting in their way, and not the cases where you're saying, no, we're going head on.
I guess for us, it's kind of looking at it in what do we actually believe at the end of the day continuous monitoring is going to be about. And I think Abbott and Dexcom have made this incredible new leap of technology that allows us to monitor glucose levels into the body. The medical device companies that have been historically single-handedly focused on diabetes, that's what they're really good at. That's where they had a massive impact in. But I guess our fundamental belief is kind of different in the sense that we believe that right now we're just at the tip of the iceberg. And the way that we're thinking about monitoring is how do we bring it from something that right now tens of millions of people with diabetes are using to somewhere where every single person in the world could. And that for us just requires a complete different way of thinking about the problem. I think cost is paramount, right? In medical devices, the big thing about, ultimately if what insurers will pay for this, that's what we should be pricing it. And that's true. That's because it's specifically for diabetes, right? And they don't want to give up on profit margins or anything. But if you actually change the framework and say, well, actually want to build something that can be built for every single person in the world, cost becomes a complete different, you start to think about cost in a completely different way. Glucose in isolation is very good for diabetes, but it's probably not good enough for every single application in health. So you got to build for multi-analyte. So ultimately, it's like, who are you building for and what are you building for? And I think, Abbott and Dexcom have been single-handedly focusing on diabetes, and they've done a tremendous job at that. But if you change your framing and say, actually want to build a platform that can have an impact outside of diabetes and can have an impact on all different health applications, the way that you build your technology is going to be drastically different. What you thought was good enough for diabetes is just unfortunately not good enough for the everyday consumer. And that's what the pillars that we've built in the company around has been. Most of the decision making has been about, can you make it affordable for every single person? Can you make the insights valuable for every single health application? Which is a complete different way of seeing the problem. And you ultimately end up developing a solution which is really different to where the incumbents are currently are.
Joe, when we spoke last, you introduced a concept I thought was super interesting, which was that of static versus dynamic moats. Is this enough to clear you up, or you know where I'm headed with this?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess I sort of touched upon it a little bit earlier, but I guess the underlying differentiation is a moat that once overcome, doesn't really change over time, right? So like if you think about the analogy of a physical moat, you're not making that moat broader or deeper. And over time, as people come to attack the castle, if you like, they can fill in that moat. There's ways to get around it. So as Ren mentioned, the patent point might be an example of that. That is not making it increasingly difficult over time to attack the castle. It becomes an obstacle, and as resources, technology, etc., aggregates outside the moat, it becomes harder and harder to defend. The dynamic moat concept is much more around trying to find routes to deepen and widen that moat over time. So network effects is the classic example. Network effects get stronger over time. So the chances of being able to displace, for example, YouTube as the home of video on the internet is incredibly difficult, because as YouTube continues to be the destination platform for all the creators, it then attracts all of the viewers. And because it's got all the viewers, it attracts all of the creators. So there's a real dynamic moat there over time that is deepening and widening the defensibility around that value proposition. And I think, as we talked about sequencing earlier, there's a time for both, but I think as soon as possible for founders to be able to get onto that journey of building the more dynamic moats that make it more likely that you're hitting a kind of escape velocity and a compounding effect that leads to winner takes all dynamics, the more that is a fit with a venture scale outcome.
Yeah, most often you can use a static moat as cover while you're building the dynamic moat. Is that also how you've thought about it, Ren?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, to the point earlier, I think, patents is a great example. There's so many medical devices that have a patent that gives us pretty much protection towards using the technology for a long period of time. But, you can't hide behind that forever. And in fact, actually, when you think about what is really unique about what we're building at Sava, you would rarely see Raf and I really defend, we've got this great patent portfolio that's going to last forever. We actually really don't think what the biggest protection ultimately for Sava is going to be about. It's going to be about something completely different. And, I think it's just kind of breaking this concept of, I think companies become quite lazy after a while if they hide too much behind static moats. And you end up, and a lot of times also forgetting about what the user actually wants to see. It makes you lazy towards building a beautiful user experience, which ultimately for us is going to be a big driver and a differentiating point in the long term. So yeah, I guess that's kind of been the strategy since day one. So you'll rarely see Raf and I speak about how a patent portfolio or a regulatory mark will give us great defensibility in the long term. I don't think that's really what Sava's about.
I guess one way to think about it is it kind of gives you the right to start digging, right? Like, because you hear a lot about them at the moment with AI, collapsing moats, that speed is the moat or capital is the moat. They're not moats in the long run. They are a head start that gives you the right to start digging an actual moat over time. And I think it's a similar point.
Exactly. I think it gives you a window of opportunity to build something incredible, right? And something that obviously makes them worthwhile spending a lot of effort and a lot of capital in, but it just won't last forever. I guess it's the bottom line.
Yeah, I was allowed to say that to a certain, I mean, it's full multivariate, but to a certain extent, I personally view innovation almost as a moat, especially in this space. Because if you don't have the right culture, and you can see this with a lot of pharma companies, they use almost the money they generate as a moat, which over time I don't think is sustainable. It has worked up until now. But if you look at the amount of innovation that happens in these big, massive drug companies, it's not very high. Okay, they have distribution as a moat, but in terms of innovation, they usually end up buying drugs that have been built by other companies. So they don't really innovate, and they become more financial institutions rather than innovative companies. So it's kind of like, how do you build your culture so that innovation is at the heart of everything you do? So over time it compounds. And then even if the patent world didn't exist, the innovation would enable you to build a better product, to build more features that essentially the consumer would want to use on a day-to-day basis. So I think there are loads of companies where initially you're like, well, this is crazy. They've got loads of consumers, but over time, if they didn't build the right culture, they're going to get displaced. And maybe it'll take longer just because they're in the hardware world, but they still will get displaced, I would say.
Ren, you spoke about bottlenecks in the system and owning those bottlenecks. Can you talk a bit about how you're thinking about it?
we have to go a little bit way back in terms of when Raf and I looked like these two crazy people trying to build hardware and consumer.
You still do that.
Yeah, some people might still call us crazy, I think. But I think that kind of boils down to like, in our experience, there's always been two different ways in which people can think about building a moat or kind of like exploring the consumer market. And it got to a point where I think, especially in the preventative health space, people were focusing a lot about, what we have to really solve for is a beautiful user experience. There's this kind of like notion that, hardware will always get commoditized away. You just build on top of existing hardware solutions, you crack a beautiful user experience. And that's how you're going to crack molecular tracking, metabolic health monitoring. And there's been so many companies that have been born in that space. Whereas Rafa and I kind of look at it in a completely different way. We just saw the barrier to building beautiful apps, user experience, becoming easier and easier over time. So we never really thought that being the bottleneck, but actually where the value in this whole market was concentrating was in pretty much two companies, which were Abbott and Dexcom, that were the only companies that had the ability to unlock molecular health data in real time. Right. So we started to look at where do we actually think the bottleneck of the space being? Where do we think value is actually accruing? And ultimately, I think over the years, it's becoming more and more obvious that, you've got AI, you've got the best tools in the world, but whatever AI insights or algorithms are going to build are only going to be as good as the data that we're building on top of. And the bottleneck in human biology is always going to be how do we build human biological to digital interfaces that allows us to then plug in the most advanced algorithmic tools or AIs to be able to derive insights from it. So we just always believe that for human body health monitoring, the interface with biology and the digital world was always going to be the bottleneck. And that's why we were so adamant in making sure that we could solve that problem first. And the way that we see it is that's not going to change anytime soon. The biggest problem towards building new applications in health, in our opinion, is going to be how well and how much data do we have about human biology. And this is going to be the same. So I think so long as we focus on that, I think ultimately we'll be focused on very high value problems that not a lot of companies will have the ability to do.
When you guys think about AI as a kind of, I guess, like a tailwind or a technology paradigm shift, in one sense, there's not like an obvious reason why your core product is a huge beneficiary of AI in terms of it doesn't make it necessarily easier for you guys to build, right? But are you thinking about it as the overall tailwind behind AI creates a moment in time where the data that you are extracting is even more valuable to an end consumer? And so there's a tailwind behind your, the Sava story, but it's kind of indirect. Is that the way you're thinking about it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think we've seen with AI at the moment, it's as good as the data you put into it. And the more data you have, the better it becomes. So in a way, it's kind of like if we don't have the ability, and right now we don't, or at least there's definitely a disconnect in the healthcare world, is like we don't have the ability to gather, as Ren said, biological data in a easy fashion, I would say. And when you do, you can't even get access to that data. So you can't do anything about that data. So it's kind of, it almost stays in the analog world, or it stays in the doctor's office, or it stays segregated in whatever, your healthcare system. So it'll take much longer, if not never, for the government to utilize AI to look at health data. So I think by taking control of the experience end to end, we can essentially leverage the power of AI with the data we collect.
But I guess kind of like to build on top of this, it's, up until now, there's always been a bit of pushback in terms of saying, look, you're going to unlock all this continuous data about human biology. What are you going to do with it? Do we even know how to interpret it? But I think what AI is doing now is just kind of basically making very clear that if you have more data, you can actually improve on the insights that you can produce. And that's like becoming obvious, right? There's incomprehensible data sets for the human eye that now you plug into an AI tool and it kind of gives you the best insights you could possibly imagine. And right now, this is exactly the kind of space that we're in. So I think there's a general consensus that with a ton of data, with a vast amount of data sets, you could be able to really understand systems in a way that was just impossible to do before. But really what's missing is kind of like really, the translating the biological signals into a digital one. So I think it's kind of putting us in an advantage where there's kind of like this beautiful moment in time where we can analyze all the data that we want in a way that is unprecedented, we can never do before. There's a massive societal shift towards focusing on health and well-being and preventative health. And there's just this massive bottleneck, which is we still don't have enough information about the human body. Everything is reactive, it's episodic, you have to go to a lab. Some companies are trying to make that a little bit easier, but it's still going to be a moment in time where the real inflection point is going to be about streamlining the human body in real time and being able to plug it into all these tools that are coming out today to be able to kind of have this new insight of health or new system of health monitoring that up until now was frankly impossible to have, because a single human can't actually analyze all this data. But now that we're becoming so good at deriving insights from it, I think you can totally see the path where unlocking more data is going to be resulting in a lot of value to the end consumer.
Yeah, it's one of the things we've been thinking about quite a lot is in the future with, I mean, by definition, AI is training on every publicly available data source, right? So one of the areas where you can build defensibility and a moat is some kind of proprietary data.
Proprietary.
And already we're seeing lots of companies that are building various different hardware devices that can capture ambient voice data or ambient movement data. So I guess kind of feed that engine. You guys are going a step even further, because whilst it's relatively trivial to build a microphone inside a desk lamp to build a smart home device, trying to get biological data from a living human body is an extraordinary technology leap. So it makes total sense.
We're coming up on time, guys, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you a bit about Europe. Because Europe, of course, is home to all of us, and we're very passionate about Europe, I hope. And I think for that reason, it would be interesting to ask you, you can always talk about Europe being not as fast moving and not as capital, a washing capital as our US counterparts. Where do you think that building from Europe is actually a moat and something that's powerful?
I would say one of the biggest advantages in Europe, which is probably the politically incorrect part, is that since there's, I think at the later stages of venture, there's less funding and really hard deep tech companies. I think things are starting to change, but the reality is there's just more funding in the US when you look at later stages. I think extremely talented technical people are just cheaper, right? That's kind of like an obvious advantage, which sounds kind of horrible, but Europe is an amazing powerhouse of scientific innovation. Like if you just look at the best publishing outlets, something like, 30-40% of all published papers that are pushing the boundaries of what's possible are done here in Europe. We've got incredible institutions, Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial, which Rafa and I came out of just in the UK. So there's just a lot of raw horsepower in terms of scientific discovery and innovation. There definitely is a bit of a gap in terms of the amount of funding that you see in the later stage of companies. There's still a lot, and to this day, Rafa and I struggle a lot, which is, people just see something scientifically difficult and hardware and just get really scared away, whereas probably wouldn't see the same amount of reaction if we were in the US. I think this is changing a lot. But what this means that effectively is that we've got incredible access to some of the best engineers and scientists you could possibly imagine that are coming out of university, and they don't know where else to go work at other than a bank or a consulting company or some fintech unicorn company. And the only other choice that they have to work on something that is meaningful, which is hard sciences in the physical world, is a company like Sava. And for us, it's been an incredible opportunity to take advantage of. We can get these really talented, hungry, mission-driven people that really science is ultimately something they're super passionate about right at their doorstep. And we've been able to recruit extremely well because of that. So I would say it's kind of a bit of a double-edged sword in that perspective, which is, on one side, you told me there's a narrative that there's less funding, but on the other side, there's like an extreme, huge talent pool of really talented individuals that we can hire, and they're right at the doorstep. There's just less competition for them, which is kind of, I guess, probably the downside of being in Europe.
Am I right in saying that, and this is a bit particular to you, but regulatory approval in Europe is actually easier than the FDA? And for that reason, that's an entry point in the beginning, which could be an opportunity and a positive for entrance, but it lowers, of course, your regulatory protection later on.
Yeah, that's definitely an advantage. And you could argue that if you built in the US, you could also utilize a similar strategy, but by building in the US, usually you have to raise more money, so you have to justify a bigger market. So in the end, building in Europe in that sense, you can build by raising less money and still justify the cost of building because the regulatory burden is lower. But then at the same time, you've got way more Chinese copycats, for example. So I think it's all a balance. I think in Europe, I mean, I echo everything that Ren said. Maybe on the more downside, the ecosystem is still not big enough because we haven't had enough companies build within Europe. And obviously it's changing, but there's some stuff that hasn't been tried out in Europe in the sense that it's only US companies that have done it. So even recruiting that talent pool that has done it before is impossible. So, or very difficult. So you have to figure out way more stuff by yourself, which is really exciting. But I think it reminds me of the, I think the Bolt/Uber rivalry in the sense that Bolt was like pretty much, I would say, similar position than ours, except they had a massive competitor. And I would say we don't have a direct competitor. But in a sense, it was like no one has done it before in Europe. So it was like, do we recruit from the US or do we actually figure out yourself? And they decided to figure this out themselves, which is exactly what we're doing. So I think it's really exciting to build in Europe. That's the conclusion of my argument.
Final question for the three of you. What's the biggest misconception that you see founders having about moats? You're all three mentor level now, mentor stage. You've come to the point in your life where people come to you and ask questions. So what do you most often see people getting wrong when it comes to moats?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily getting things wrong, but I think it's maybe misunderstanding the relative power of different moats over time. So some of the stuff that we talked about before, to Ren's point, if you're going into a conversation and the key thing that you're hanging your hat on in as being a moat for the rest of the lifetime of the business is a patent or a regulatory, step, that just doesn't really communicate a deep understanding of what's going to create compounding advantage over time. So I don't think it's a misconception per se, but I think it's a question for founders to ask themselves as they're building the narrative and building their own conviction that this is something they want to spend the next 10, 15, 20 years of their life building, understanding how they're going to get to that point where you have something that genuinely can compound over time. And it's okay. I mean, particularly in the early stage, right? We don't expect people to show up with it built because by definition, that's an unreasonable expectation. But being able to articulate both the long-term vision and then the very clear limiting factors that you need to unlock in order to get there and keep the show on the road on the way is probably the most important thing from my point of view.
From my point of view, specifically about medical devices, maybe the big misconception would be something like there is no value, which I equate to moat in this case, but no value in the consumer facing element of the product, or there's way less value in the actual software piece itself. And I think that's a big misconception because everyone is used to a beautifully polished app on the App Store. But actually in the world of like medical devices where there's a hardware element, the moat is actually the end-to-end experience. From the moment you open the package, the features that are contained on the hardware element, all the way to how the user uses the app, which traditionally by medical device companies, that's not their forte. So it's really that end-to-end experience. And I think that's very misunderstood by most people.
Yeah, for me, more than misunderstanding, it's kind of like a bit of a learning more than anything else, is that I think the best moats typically are very non-consensus. And I think my reminder for founders would be sometimes you do feel like you're the only one that understands why you've got a great moat. And that is actually a great place to be in because time will tell, and time will always tell, I think. And it's probably one of the things that I'm pretty happy about is that there's been multiple moments in time where Raf and I thought we were completely crazy. Are we actually thinking about where value is accruing in a different way? Are we focusing on different things? And, there's from the venture community to like other founders, people were just thinking that what we were doing was completely insane. But I think ultimately with time, I think we're getting to the point where it's becoming a little bit more consensus, but there was a time where it was really non-obvious. And I like to believe that some of the best moats that have ever been created have started off in a very wacky, non-obvious place. And I think that's a totally fine place to be in.
I think just to add to that, Ren, you guys are a great case study because until maybe 12 months ago, building hardware was still the craziest thing anyone could come up with as an idea, right? But you've been building this for years, and then all of a sudden the AI moment has happened and everyone's talking about how interesting hardware is again, because it's the only moat that's left. So building in the wilderness for a few years and having conviction in what you're building is, it's coming to bear now.
Joe, Ren, Raf, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I think that there will be a lot of founders out there that have learned a thing or two about how to build moats in consumer. Thank you so much for taking the time to help the ecosystem.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you for
Thanks for
having
having
us.
us, Andreas.